Welcome to another edition of the Sundown series. Today we will be visiting Deerfield, Illinois. Now, this is going to be one of those readings, I guess you can say, one of those videos where I read from the experience of someone who lived there and talks about the experiences they dealt with as far as this town goes in the racism in November of 2018. So it's not an old article, but it's not a new one either. But the fact that it was written in 2018 and it's 2020 lets you know. In 1962, my parents adopted an infant girl who they named Rebecca. Rebecca's birth certificate identified her as Caucasian. However, over the course of a few months, her skin darkened. And when my parents began to ask questions, they learned that Rebecca was half African American. While they were surprised, my parents were split on how to proceed. My dad, a prominent businessman, felt that raising a black child in an all-white Deerfield would be too much of a hardship on the family and Rebecca herself. My mom, an ardent civil rights activist, had bonded with her baby and wanted to keep Rebecca. Eventually, they made the gut-wrenching decision to relinquish Rebecca to social services for re-adoption. I was adopted several weeks later, replacing Rebecca. So this lets you know that the person who is writing this article is a PC woman. With the luxury of hindsight, it's tempting to harshly judge my parents' decision, which is what I did most of my life. However, as I recently discovered, there's more to the story than what meets the eye. 3 years prior to Rebecca's adoption in 1959, the all-white North Shore suburb of Deerfield, where my parents lived, had condemned a housing development which was in the process of being built when village officials discovered that the developers intended to sell the homes to African Americans. Town leaders didn't openly admit to opposing integrated housing. Rather, they objected on the basis that Deerfield suddenly needed more parks. A debate ensued. Bankrolled by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a fervent supporter of integration, the housing developer Morris Milgram sued the town, and tensions were still high in 1962 as the developer's case slowly made its way through courts. Milgram would eventually lose the case when the Supreme Court of the United States denied his appeal. Those were turbulent years in a fractured Deerfield. A cross was burned on the front lawn of a resident who, like my parents, was pro-integration. My brother, who was 8 years old at the time, remembers our parents keeping the curtains drawn and never leaving their cars in the driveway because they feared vandals or worse. The Deerfield story was covered by national media, including the New York Times, Time Magazine, and the CBS Evening News, who referred to Deerfield as the Little Rock of the North, in reference to Little Rock, Arkansas' stubborn resistance to school desegregation laws. Another incident that factored into my parents' decision to relinquish Rebecca occurred in 1961. A Deerfield pastor, Paul Berggren, publicly announced his intention to adopt a Negro child, in part because of his disappointment in the outcome of the fight to integrate Deerfield. The announcement triggered anonymous death threats against the Berggren family, and Berggren's teenage daughter was called names and ostracized at school. Berggren eventually dropped his adoption plan. Today, Deerfield population is still 94% white, which is hardly an accident. Following the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, Illinois, like many states, passed its own fair housing regulations. The state requires 10% of all housing to be designated for individuals and families earning no more than 60% of the area's median income. However, Deerfield applied for home rule status from the state in the 1970s. This rule exempts Deerfield from the state housing regulations that often result in the greater diversity. Deerfield Mayor Harriet Rosenthal believes Deerfield has an ethical and moral obligation to provide housing for middle-class families, but acknowledges that statutorily, Deerfield has no obligation. In 2015, a 48-unit affordable housing project was proposed by a partnership that included the very same Zion Lutheran Church where Paul Berggren was pastor. As in 1959, opponents to the housing complex objected on the grounds that it would lead to declining home values, school overcrowding, and traffic congestion, and because they wanted to preserve the community's character, something of a code word among opponents in both the 1959 and today. Deerfield was divided along the same lines as it was in 1959, and the effort to build more affordable housing seemed doomed. However, developers returned this year with a scaled-back plan to build 25 units, and in August received a key vote of approval to proceed with their plans to build the apartment complex behind the church. Supporters of Zion Woods welcome the development as a reflection of their personal values, as they believe there is no reason why the people who serve them in their restaurants or make their lattes or do their nails shouldn't live in the same community. They believe diversity is desirable and affordable housing is a critical means by which to receive a diverse community. When Dr. Melba Sullivan grew up in Deerfield, she was one of the few people of color in the community. She described what it was like. We lived across the street from the Walgreens corporate headquarters, but we couldn't walk into a Walgreens and find products to do our hair. When we went to the grocery store, we couldn't get the things we were used to eating, like black-eyed peas on New Year's and collard greens. Those are the day-to-day things that matter. I asked Sullivan, who was a doctorate degree in clinical community psychology, if she'd experienced racism while growing up in Deerfield in the 80s. She described how a real estate agent asked the Sullivans' white neighbors if it was okay for a black family to buy in the neighborhood. And when her mother opened the door, she was often asked if the owners of the house were home. She also told me about gifts that went along with growing up in Deerfield. I'm not fazed by being the only black person in the room and move between a variety of worlds and meaningful relationships with people who look different than me. I'm able to recognize the humanity of white people instead of dealing in stereotypes. I have a profound respect of diverse racial, economic, cultural, religious dimensions that I have an opportunity to be a part of that comes from the fact that I've been navigating these since I was 7 and moved to Deerfield. Despite these gifts, Sullivan asserts that Deerfield would benefit from more racial and economic integration, the sort that would result from more affordable housing. She believes that integration is important to a community because it creates. I had to step off right quick and take an important phone call right in the middle of what I was reading, so I'm going to go back and read this paragraph again. It says, despite these gifts, Sullivan asserts that Deerfield would benefit more from racial and economic integration, the sort that will result from more affordable housing. She believes that integration is important to a community because it creates the opportunity for people to build emotional ties that enhance their ability to empathize and show up as a compassionate friend with someone who doesn't look like them. History lessons are still being learned and taught in Deerfield. Deerfield High School has added the 1959 integration controversy to its curriculum alongside more flattering aspect of Deerfield history, such how Deerfield's founder, Lyman Wilmot, allowed his home to be used as a stop on the Underground Railroad to Canada. Beginning in January 2019, the Deerfield Library will host or has hosted a series of panels and guest speakers, including myself and Angel Smith, the child who my parents adopted before me in 1962. More information about the fight to integrate Deerfield 60-year reflection. So that's pretty much that article right there. And see, that's the whole, this one was talking basically about they were pretty much anti-immigration. The fact that they got compared to Little Rock, Arkansas of that time, to be compared to that, that's saying a lot. But I told one of my subscribers, we gonna be in the state of Illinois for quite a while, because like I said, it's a lot of towns that could be deemed as sundown towns or towns that experience a lot of racism. And I'm glad that we're covering towns that are not considered to be the South in some aspects, because a lot of people think that racism only dwelled in the South. It's just that in the South, it was more commonly known and it was more heard of and it was more mainstream. And they kind of shielded the North as this town, these places that were, I guess you could say, more liberal rather than conservative. But trust and believe, by the time we get through this entire series, you'll understand that is definitely not the case. But this pretty much concludes this edition of the Sundown series. This was Deerfield, Illinois. Notice that it said village of Deerfield. It didn't say county of or town of. It kind of reminds me of the one that I just recently did. I forgot which one it was. And that one was considered to be a town, DeLand. I think it was called DeLand, Illinois. But y'all let me know what you think, and I will talk to you in the next one.